is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
Welcome to Mental Health 101, where understanding begins, healing grows, and every conversation brings us closer to a healthier mind. Why songs help us survive, music, memory, and mental health part 2.
As we introduce the topic of surviving with music and mental health in part 1, and now we update our discussion through early modern and contemporary applications. The material should be applied to assist us in understanding how music as an art is a tremendous asset for the significant challenges that we face today.
Indeed, so let's make how the Reformation era contributed to understanding music's role in mental health.
Martin Luther, who struggled throughout life with what he called the spiritual attacks of depression and despair, developed profound insights into music's therapeutic power. He famously wrote that music is the art of the prophets, the only art that can calm the agitations of the soul, and it is one of the most magnificent and delightful presents God has given us. This wasn't theoretical. Luther used music as his primary weapon against the severe depression that plagued him. Luther composed hymns specifically designed to combat despair and anxiety. A Mighty Fortress is Our God, written around 1529, transforms Psalm 46 into a battle hymn against spiritual oppression. The soul's martial rhythm and confident declarations, and though this world, with devils filled, should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, provided cognitive and emotional fortification against the intrusive thoughts and feelings that characterize Luther's depressive episodes. Historians record that when Luther felt particularly oppressed by depression, he would gather friends together to sing hymns. He wrote to a friend, "When I am assailed with heavy tribulations, I rush out among my pigs rather than remain alone by myself." Music is a gift and grace of God, not an invention of men. Thus, it derives the power of the devil and makes people cheerful. This is remarkably sophisticated therapeutic practice, using communal music making to interrupt depressive rumination and create positive emotional states. The Reformation principle of sola gratia, grace alone, had profound mental health implications. If salvation depended entirely on divine grace rather than human performance, then personal worth isn't contingent on achievement or approval. This theological truth, when internalized through repeated singing, created what psychologists now call unconditional positive regard, a secure identity not dependent on external validation. The music of the 1960s sometimes reflected this Protestant understanding of grace and human brokenness. Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire from 1963, despite being a love song, captures the transformative, sometimes terrifying power of authentic commitment. Cash understood human weakness. His struggles with addiction were well documented, yet his music consistently pointed toward redemption and transformation rather than despair. Mr. Daniel's favorite artists consider Aretha Franklin's Respect in 1967, which took
Yes.
Otis Redding's song and transformed it into an anthem of dignity and worth. Franklin, raised in her father's Baptist church, brought gospel sensibility to secular music, insisting on inherent human value and demanding it be recognized. This reflects the Reformation principle that every person possesses dignity as God's image bearer, regardless of race, gender, or social status. Luther's colleague, Philip Melanchthon, wrote that music is a gift of God, not a gift of men. It drives away the devil and makes people cheerful. Then one forgets all wrath, unchastity, arrogance, and other vices. The reformers understood that music doesn't just express emotion, it shapes them. By filling minds with truth-saturated melodies, they created psychological resilience against the intrusive lies that characterize depression and anxiety. The Protestant tradition of congregational singing, putting hymnals in everyone's hands rather than leaving music to professional choirs, democratized music's therapeutic benefits. When entire communities sing together weekly, they created what we might now call collective mental health maintenance, regular doses of truth filled melody that protected against the cognitive distortions and emotional dysregulation that lead to mental illness. The emphasis on sung scripture was particularly important. By setting biblical text to memorable melodies, the reformers ensured that people internalized divine promises at a level deeper than mere intellectual assent. When Luther sang, "And take us our life, goods, fame, child, and wife, though these all be gone, our victory has been won," he was programming his mind with truth that could withstand depression's worst assaults. In conclusion, the Reformation era demonstrated that music combined with theological truth could serve as both preventive medicine and acute intervention for mental health struggles, establishing practices of communal singing and personal hymn use that protected psychological well being across entire communities while providing immediate relief for individuals in crisis.
Mr. Meg, the evangelical revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries brought a different approach to music and emotion. How these contribute to understanding mental health?
The Great Awakenings introduce what we might call emotionally integrated spirituality, the idea that authentic faith engages feelings as well as intellect. Figures like Jonathan Edwards and Charles Wesley understood that conversion and spiritual formation involve the whole person, including emotional life. This represented a crucial development in Christian psychology. Charles Wesley, who wrote over 6,000 hymns, created songs that address the full spectrum of human emotional experience. Consider "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing," written in 1739, which moves from personal testimony through communal celebration to universal hope. Or "Love Divine, All Loves Excelling," which speaks of transformation through divine love in ways that modern attachment theory would recognize as describing secure attachment patterns. Wesley's hymns provided language for emotional states that people lacked vocabulary to express. Many people experiencing depression, anxiety, or spiritual confusion found their inner experience articulated in Wesley's songs, which created what psychologists call felt understanding, the healing that comes from knowing someone else comprehends your struggle. Jonathan Edwards, in his treatise concerning religious affections, argued that true spirituality necessarily involves emotional engagement, what he called religious affections. But he distinguished between authentic emotional experience grounded in truth and mere sentimentalism. This is remarkably sophisticated psychological insight. Emotions matter, but they must be properly formed and directed. The music of the 1960s and 70s sometimes achieved this emotional authenticity. Otis Redding's "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay" from 1968 expresses existential loneliness and purposelessness with haunting honesty. Sitting, watching, wasting time, feeling 2,000 miles from home. Yet the song's gentle melody and Redding's warm voice transform potential despair into something closer to peaceful melancholy, demonstrating that acknowledging difficult feelings doesn't require being overshadowed by them. Or consider Carole King's "You Got a Friend" from 1971, which offers genuine comfort without sappy positivity. King acknowledges that times get hard, skies grow dark, and trouble comes. She doesn't minimize suffering, but she promises steadfast presence. "Just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running to see you again." This mirrors the divine promise throughout Scripture: "I will never leave you nor forsake you." The revival tradition understood that emotional suppression breeds psychological pathology. By creating spaces where people could express grief, joy, repentance, and celebration through music, they provided what we now call affect regulation, the capacity to experience and process emotions healthily. Tent meetings and camp meetings featured prolonged singing that allowed people to move through emotional states toward resolution and peace. This contrasts sharply with contemporary hookup culture, which promises emotional freedom through detachment, but actually creates what psychologists call affect dysregulation, the inability to properly process feelings. Casual sexual relationships require suppressing natural desires for commitment and permanence, creating internal conflict between behavior and emotional needs. The result is the epidemic of anxiety and depression we see among young people today. The revival emphasis on conversion narratives, songs that told stories of transformation from despair to hope, provide templates for understanding personal struggle. Hymns like Amazing Grace, written by former slave trader John Newton in 1772, modeled how to integrate difficult past experiences into a coherent narrative of redemption. This is precisely what trauma therapy attempts to achieve, helping people construct meaningful narratives from fragmented, painful experiences. The camp meeting tradition also created intergenerational musical communities where older believers mentored younger ones in both musical skill and emotional wisdom. Young people learn not just how to sing, but how to process life's difficulties through song, practices that protected mental health across the lifespan. The revival movements demonstrated that emotional authenticity integrated with theological truth creates psychological health, providing models for communal emotional processing and an individual affect regulation that contemporary mental health practice is only beginning to rediscover. In conclusion, on the other hand, secular culture's emphasis on emotional detachment produces the very pathologies these traditions prevented.
Mr. Meg, moving into more recent history, how did figures like C.S. Lewis think about music and mental health?
C.S. Lewis, while not primarily a musician, wrote extensively about how aesthetic experience, including music, shapes human psychology and spiritual formation. In The Abolition of Man, he argued that education should cultivate what he called trained emotions, the capacity to feel appropriately about things that truly matter. Music plays a crucial role in this emotional training. Lewis distinguished what he called real music that enlarges the soul and sentimental music that merely manipulates emotion. In his essay on church music, he wrote about how corporate singing creates fellowship and worship that transcends individual preferences and ego. He understood that when communities sing together, they participate in something larger than themselves, a transcendent reality that provides psychological grounding and meaning. The Victorian and Edwardian hymn writers Lewis grew up with, people like Francis Ridley Havergal, Fanny Crosby, and Horatio Spafford, created songs that addressed suffering with remarkable honesty while maintaining ultimate hope. Consider Spafford's It Is Well With My Soul, written in 1873 after his four daughters drowned in a shipwreck. The lyrics acknowledge devastating loss when sorrows like sea billows roll, yet move toward peace grounded in divine sovereignty. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, It is well with my soul. This represents sophisticated cognitive work, what psychologists now call meaning making after trauma. Spafford didn't deny his grief or pretend the tragedy didn't matter. Instead, he relocated his suffering within a larger narrative of divine love and ultimate redemption. By setting this truth to music, he created a tool not just for his own healing, but for countless others facing devastating loss. Lewis argued in Surprised by Joy that certain aesthetic experiences, including music, generate what he called joy with a capital J, which he described as an unsatisfied desire which is in itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. This longing points beyond itself towards transcendent reality, creating what we might call healthy restlessness, the opposite of the numbing despair that characterizes much contemporary mental illness. The music of the 1950s and 60s sometimes captured this Louisian joy. The Beach Boys' God Only Knows from 1966, written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher, expresses devoted love with almost liturgical beauty. Wilson, who struggled with severe mental illness throughout his life, and we featured him on an episode, also created teenage symphonies for God amid his psychological suffering. The song's complex harmonies and earnest lyrics about permanent commitment stand in stark contrast to hookup culture's cynicism about lasting love. Or consider Roy Orbison's Only the Lonely from 1960, which transforms personal heartbreak into something approaching universal truth about human longing. Orbison's soaring voice and the song's dramatic arrangement elevate ordinary romantic disappointment into meditation on the human condition, our deep need for a connection and the pain of isolation. This is what Lewis meant by art that enlarges the soul rather than merely entertaining it. Lewis also wrote about the dangers of what he called music that tries to do our feeling for us, manipulative soundtracks and sentimental songs that bypass critical thought and induce emotions divorced from truth. He would have recognized much contemporary music as precisely this kind of manipulation. Songs that celebrate hookup culture, normalize depression and anxiety as inevitable, or encourage victimhood narratives that create learned helplessness. The Victorian hymn tradition understood that music should educate emotions, teaching people what to feel about what truly matters. Fanny Crosby, who wrote over 8,000 hymns despite being blind from infancy, created songs that consistently directed attention beyond personal circumstance toward divine faithfulness. Her hymn, Blessed Assurance, written in 1873, models healthy identity formation. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Here, identity is grounded in divine relationship rather than achievement, appearance, or social approval. Lewis's friend Dorothy Sayers wrote in The Mind of the Maker that creative work, including musical composition, reflects the divine image in humanity. We create because we're made in the image of the Creator. This suggests that engaging with beautiful music isn't frivolous entertainment, but an essential human activity that connects us to our deepest desire and ultimate purpose. Depression often involves losing this sense of connection and meaning. Music can restore it. Lewis and the Victorian tradition he valued demonstrated that music shapes emotional life and cognitive patterns in ways that either support or undermine mental health, distinguishing between authentic aesthetic experience that enlarges the soul and sentimental manipulation that diminishes it. In conclusion, these distinctions are crucial for understanding why certain music heals while other music harms.
Mr. Meg, some modern psychology and neuroscience are discovering what these religious thinkers knew all song or all day long.
Yes, exactly. The American Songwriter article that was describes research from the University of Amsterdam showing that music affects memory more powerfully than other triggers, with certain songs remaining accessible even to dementia patients who've lost most other memories. But this simply confirms what Augustine observed 16 centuries ago, that musical memory operates differently from other forms of recall, penetrating deeper into consciousness. Dr. Ashley Burgoyne told BBC that understanding music's power to lock into long term memory could help make better clinical decisions about what music is going to do and be the most therapeutic. But the early church already made these clinical decisions systematically. They knew that certain psalms help specific conditions. Psalm 42 for spiritual dryness, Psalm 51 for guilt and shame, Psalm 121 for anxiety about the future. Contemporary attachment theory confirms what early Christians practiced. Research shows that secure attachment, knowing you're loved unconditionally, creates resilience against mental illness. The Christian practice of singing about divine love repeatedly internalizes this secure attachment at a level deeper than intellectual knowledge. When Augustine sang hymns about God's unchanging faithfulness, he was quite literally programming his nervous system with attachment security. Neuroscience research on music and emotions reveal that melody activates multiple brain regions simultaneously, areas involved in memory, emotion, motor control, and language processing. This explains why music can reach dementia patients when other interventions fail. But it also explains why the church fathers prescribed psalm singing for depression and anxiety. They empirically observed that music affected consciousness in uniquely powerful ways. The research on earworms, catchy tunes that get stuck in our heads, reveals why the reformers emphasized memorable melodies paired with theological content. If a song is going to repeat in your mind hundreds of times, better that it carries life giving truth rather than destructive lies. Luther's hymns were specifically designed to be catchy, precisely because they function as cognitive protection against intrusive negative thoughts. Modern music therapy validates ancient practices. Therapists now use music to help trauma patients process difficult emotions, to improve mood in depressed clients, and to reduce anxiety. But monasteries were doing music therapy 1,500 years ago, prescribing certain specific chants for specific psychological and spiritual conditions. The 1960s and 70s music that the American Songwriter article referred to mentions songs by Elvis, ABBA, and others often carried psychological health precisely because it reflected a residual Christian worldview. Elvis's Love Me Tender from 1956 celebrates gentle, committed love. ABBA's Dancing Queen from 1976, despite being about nightclub culture, exudes innocent joy and celebration. These songs came from cultures still shaped by Christian values about relationships, community, and human dignity. Contrast this with contemporary music celebrating hookup culture, drug use, and victimhood narratives. Research consistently shows that exposure to media celebrating casual sex correlates with depression, anxiety, and relationship dysfunction. This isn't surprising to anyone familiar with Christian teaching. Behaviors disconnected from human nature's design create psychological damage. The neuroscience of habits confirms why the church emphasized daily offices and regular psalm singing. Repeated behaviors create neural pathways, what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity. By singing truth filled songs daily, early Christians literally rewired their brains towards health and resilience. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy tries to accomplish the same rewiring, but without the communal, aesthetic, and transcendent dimensions that made Christian practice more effective. Research on social connection and mental health reveals why congregational singing protects psychological well being. Studies show that singing together creates neurochemical bonding, releases oxytocin, and generates feelings of safety and belonging. The early church intuitively understood this. Corporate worship wasn't just about individual spiritual development, but about creating communities that protected mental health through regular shared musical experience. The polyvagal theory in neuroscience explains how music affects the nervous system's stress response. Certain musical patterns activate the central vagal system, which creates feelings of safety and social engagement. This is precisely what hymns and psalms accomplish. They regulate the nervous system through melody and rhythm while simultaneously communicating cognitive content that reinforces security and hope. Contemporary scientific research is systemically confirming what religious thinkers and Christian authors recognize through centuries of careful observation and practice. Music affects human psychology more powerfully than almost any other stimulus, and certain kinds of music combined with truth filled content can prevent and heal mental illness in ways that purely clinical interventions struggle to match. In conclusion, music heals, and for centuries, Christianity has produced products of healing.
Definitely music heal. People believe in the power of music. And please do listen to our Music 101. You've contrasted the uplifting music of the 1950s, 70s with contemporary culture several times. Mr. Meg, can you be more specific about what we have lost?
Contemporary Western culture, particularly among young people, focus and faces what Viktor Frankl called a crisis of meaning. People lack transcendent purpose and grounding for identity. This produces the epidemic of depression and anxiety we see today, especially among liberal adolescent girls who report mental health diagnoses at rates over 50% compared to roughly 20% among conservative girls. The music of the 1950s to the 70s emerged from cultures that, despite their flaws, maintain some connection to Judeo Christian frameworks of meaning. Even secular songs reflected values like commitment, perseverance, community, and hope. Consider the Beatles' Here Comes the Sun from 1969, written by George Harrison after a particularly dreary English winter. The song is simple but profound. After darkness and difficulty, light returns, smiles return, life returns. This reflects what theologians call resurrection hope, confidence that death and darkness don't have the final word. Or take Smokey Robinson's Tracks of My Tears from 1965, which acknowledged the gap between public persona and private pain. My smile is my makeup I wear since my breakup with you. This is honest about human brokenness without wallowing in victimhood. Robinson presents suffering as something to be borne with dignity while seeking authentic connection rather than performing false happiness. Contemporary hookup culture, by contrast, promises liberation through sexual freedom, but delivers fragmentation and despair. Young people are taught that commitment equals oppression, that vulnerability equals weakness, that traditional relationship patterns equal patriarchal concern. But research consistently shows that the opposite. Stable, committed relationships correlate with mental health, while casual sexual relationships correlate with depression and anxiety. The early Christians would have recognized this as a predictable result of severing sexuality from its proper context. Augustine wrote extensively about disordered loves, desires pursuing objects that can't actually satisfy them. Casual sex promises intimacy but delivers isolation, promises freedom but creates bondage to instability and insecurity. The music that celebrated stable relationships and romantic commitment wasn't oppressive, it was therapeutic. When Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell sang Ain't No Mountain High Enough in 1967, they were celebrating covenant love that perseveres through obstacles. If you need me, call me, no matter where you are, no matter how far. These models secure attachment and relational permanence, exactly what human psychology requires for flourishing. Contemporary culture increasingly celebrates what previous generations would have recognized as pathology. Songs normalizing depression as an identity, anxiety as inevitable, and victimhood as virtue create cognitive patterns that produce and reinforce mental illness. When young people are constantly exposed to music celebrating these patterns, they internalize them as normal or even desirable. The difference isn't just musical, but philosophical. The 1950s through the 70s music industry, for all its problems, still operated within the cultural memory of Christian anthropology. Humans as dignity-bearing creatures capable of growth, redemption, and transcendence. Contemporary culture increasingly adapts what theologians would call anthropological pessimism. Humans are mere animals, products of genetics and environment, lacking inherent worth or purpose beyond subjective construction. The early church understood humans as created in God's image, fallen but redeemable, possessing inherent dignity and eternal purpose. In conclusion, the crisis of meaning in contemporary culture produces epidemic mental illness precisely because secular frameworks lack the transcendent grounding that Judeo-Christian tradition provided. And the music of earlier eras that reflected these traditions offered psychological protection that contemporary music increasingly undermines rather than supports.
So, Mr. Meg, this is a compelling historical and theological analysis, but what does it mean practically? How can we apply these insights today?
The first practical step is recognizing that the music we expose ourselves to shapes our psychology in profound ways. The American Songwriter article notes that songs can remain in memory for decades, but it doesn't address which songs should occupy that permanent mental real estate. If music is going to repeat in your mind thousands of times, choose songs that reinforce truth, hope, and healthy patterns rather than dysfunction and despair. The practice of communal singing needs recovery. Contemporary worship often features professional performance while congregations passively listen or minimally participate. Families can institute practices of sung prayer or bedtime hymns. Just as previous generations sang children to sleep with lullabies, modern families could use this practice therapeutically, filling young minds with melodies of security and divine love before sleep. For individuals struggling with depression or anxiety, deliberate use of specific music can provide significant help. Someone battling intrusive negative thoughts might memorize and regularly sing hymns like "It Is Well With My Soul" or psalms set to music. The recovery of music as therapy also means recovering the distinction between music that heals and music that harms. Not all music is equally beneficial. Songs celebrating hookup culture, normalizing mental illness, or reinforcing victimhood narratives actively damage psychological health. This isn't legalism, it's recognizing that some cultural products poison while others nourish. Consider practical applications by age group. For children, regular exposure to simple songs teaching theological truth, and then growing up with songs along those lines. In conclusion, music does indeed heal. Choose it wisely and prosper, as the Judeo-Christian tradition has demonstrated for centuries.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Mr. Meg. People, why songs help us survive. Music, memory, and mental health continues the exploration of music as a vital emotional lifeline, examining how songs anchor memory, regulate mood, and provide meaning during moments of stress, grief, and uncertainty. This episode goes deeper into psychological and neurological connections between sound and survival. Mr. Make, would you like to plug in something?
I appreciate the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn, GMIC, the Dr. Digital Smith, PhD. Listen to the Dr. Digital podcast and also pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon. That is Burning America and On Track, Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Make, the Dr. Digital, and so please do listen to our other podcasts, Music 101, Love Letters, and Sex 101, available where you listen to your podcast. So, Mr. Make, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Until next time, Deus Volt.
Modicon people, see you soon.